Hi, this is Mark. In this video, I'm going to talk about expansion of consciousness and psychosis and how to distinguish between the two cases. Um, Mental illness in general has an association, or a lot of times, with creativity, or creative individuals have maybe the propensity or to tend in that direction, only because, in my belief, some degree of physiological strain. It's very hard to get by in this world as a creative individual who I'm not talking about manipulation of ideas that have already been generated, or utilizing someone else's creation and kind of manipulating it to achieve a better outcome. I'm talking about going the unconventional style of creativity where you don't conform, rather you go in the opposite direction, and you have ideas that are very unconventional and likely to be um, discarded initially because of the just just because the distinction between what we know and the unknown world of chaos. And creativity always is going to start with chaos. And just like any of this great scientist who actually opened up new fields of science, like Golo, who created the um, where he was a logician, he created the theory or the incompleteness theorem. You have Tesla, who made projections, well beyond his time, and I'm sure a lot of people thought he was crazy because the projection was so far ahead that people, may have feared the unknown and what is possible at that point, because the unknown is a playing field. It's creative individuals are comfortable with the unknown, and if you fear it, which I think initially we all have fear entering this world because it is chaotic, but adaptation permits us to dampen the effect over time. And we also have a condition called latent inhibition that dampens it's a survival mechanism that dampens the level of stimuli that enters our brain in a given frame, because we treat novel information as more important than previously categorized information of the mind. And when it comes to psychosis, just think of like the concept of entropy. We Creativity, if it starts with chaos and you're dealing with a lot of bits of information that are discrete at discrete points, and it seems like they're not connected yet, but the creative individual finds bridges between the information and the bits of and ultimately, when you're very creative, you want to soak in more, because when you have more information to work with, you can generate more creative ideas. And so you kind of, if you're so divergent, it can kind of create more entropy in those localized regions. When you go into new situations, you have a spurt of your entropy, because everything's becoming novel. So you want to pull in more information in a given frame and processes, so that way you can, dictates the survivability of our, the species. And everyone needs to diverge in their lifestyle. If you want to survive in a different environment, you have to do so by going out of your comfort zone. And creative individuals do so on a daily basis by going beyond what is known and projecting into the unknown, and then collecting the chaos, organizing it, put it back into the known, and creating potential new theories and revelations that expands the bounds of the known information. And this can cause a lot of physiological strain, and that's why can be associated with mental illness, because there's a limit. There exists a limit of stress and physiological strain that causes instability. It causes, this energy instability, which essentially, think of like a bond. You have our bodies try to reach homeostasis or equilibrium. Our body's trying to tend in that direction. And think of that like an atomic bond. It's very hard to break a strong bond relative to a weak bond. Think of planes of weakness. If there's more planes of weakness, you just put the force generated along the parallel to the plane of weakness, and you break it. So, provided that there's when you have more variables that can cause physiological strain, it weakens. It creates these potential fissures or potential. You could consider it like that. Like it's analogous to that. You could consider it like a like vibrational energy that if the energy becomes great enough, or the anxiety or so forth, it can break the bond. And once that bond is split, you're lowering the potential to reach the equilibrium or homeostasis, and therefore you're creating the mental illness itself. And psychosis, you could think of it like this is where it gets into consciousness. Our consciousness adapts. We can expand it by soaking in more variables in a given frame. If we have to add more variables to the equation, consciousness should expand because you have more energy, you have more reward feedback. You're going in so long you go in the positive direction, and things are progressing, consciousness will expand. And if you go in that direction and it does so, and you're open, you're optimistic, and you're basically your entropy is increasing. But entropy does increase locally, but then it stabilizes and then it becomes a norm. It becomes a new equilibrium, or you develop a new neutral axis that is deviant from the norm, the previous norm. So when it comes to like processing speed increasing and so forth, and you have multiple ideas that diverge from the norm, this can be attributed to increased consciousness, provided that the ability to organize is still, you're able to organize the bits of information in a coherent manner. Psychosis is kind of like that, where your information range, the range of information processing is actually opening up and expanding. The field is expanding, but the problem is it's a brain abnormality that causes closure in terms of organization of the chaos. And the chaos is when it's not able to be organized, it becomes convoluted, it becomes incoherent, it becomes disorganized, and kind of a mishmash of just like information, or it actually splits from, it goes from that connectivity to basically discrete chaos, or discrete points or nodes. You can think of it like nodes that are going farther and farther apart, and therefore the connection is becoming larger. And that's why people who get psychotic, they go on, ramble, or go, and they're not able to connect the concepts together. They just talk about one point, and it's for very large distance from this point, but they're not bridging them together. They're just kind of bouncing around at different nodes and different points. And that's what psychosis essentially is. It's a break. It's when the mind's ability to actually build the connections between the information. But what if now you're able to utilize that stream of input, and you're able to now organize it, and therefore it's represented as increased consciousness. It could go well beyond what is capable, but the thing is that as humans adapt, the deviance is not going to be so, it's going to be a progression. It's going to be a slow progression. So, there could be some instances where, depending on the circumstances and, where the mindset is. I think it really depends on the mindset. When the mindset is positive, and, if society goes in the negative direction, and everyone's mindset becomes negative, and there's a few localized region, there's people who have a positive mindset, they're low stress, they're open, their mind's working in higher capacity. There's going to be a larger difference between the level of consciousness between the groups, because consciousness collapses to a point when you go in the negative direction, and then it expands outward when you go in the positive direction. When you add more variables in the equation, it expands. When you add more stimuli, it can expand, and the frequency increases, and so forth. And that's what a lot of times, when we define mental illness, there can be some confusion along, how to define it, whether it's psychosis or but the key distinguishing criteria is whether or not the information, how organized it is. And for instance, like if someone was well beyond his time and extremely creative, like Tesla, could have been, people could have thought he's like mentally ill, or, back in the day there was belief in witchcraft over here. It's just, I think that when you're so far ahead, it can be attributed. We can potentially have a propensity to label it as such, as mental illness, but in actuality, it's it's just someone whose mind is kind of well beyond what is the neutral axis of what we represent as a norm, or the average, like an average level that we can't really represent, but it's based on a relative scale. So there probably are some cases. It's probably just like the mind. When the mind evolves, we're going towards the next um, level of development because it goes. We go from simplicity to complexity. Brains become more complex. It basically able to process more information. And if you compare, there's going to be a distinction between the primitive times, the life of when we were primitive and just hunting, hunter gatherers, versus now in this age. There's a definite difference. And when you translate through the large span of time, the difference becomes more noticeable. But over a short span, it's kind of hard to. Um, there could be some outlier cases. So that's why there could be some cases where it's just an expansion of consciousness rather than psychosis, or we like to denote it as an enlightenment. However, that it's probably just when the mind is overstimulated. There's some maybe catalyst that is involved that allows your dopa synerg that's not the right word, the neurotransmitter network to kind of work in overdrive. And it's so long that it's think of it like a symphony. If the symphony's intact, if the beats are connected, and there's harmony among each of the beats. Um, there's a level of control, and when there's a level of control, that it shouldn't be dictated as psychosis. Psychosis is when the control is diminished, it's eliminated, and it's more of an issue with the brain's capacity to. It's a problem with the ability of the brain to actually process. And I think there are some instances like Bobby Fischer, who I think had who I think had low lane inhibition. He was very sensitive to stimuli. He complained about lights being too bright. It kind of clicked in my mind. I kind of considered that, and I was thinking his paranoia must have been attributed. It's interesting how there are a lot of these cases. It starts opening up when the individual ages. And you can think that if the number of bits of information you can process in a given time frame stays equivalent. However, due to the aging process, you lose oxygen levels. You may not sleep as well as you age. Your brain's capacity to organize that information gets lessened, and therefore the limit for paranoia, because there has to be some limit when the information starts to become more convoluted, results in potential paranoia. And when you're not able to make sense of it as well as you were previously, maybe it's as if Bobby Fischer was able to. It's either there's a case where you're flooded with information and it stays the same, or if that increases, there's always a limit for everyone. Their brain, when the functionality decreases, it creates even more problems with processing all the bits of information that you used to be able to process, because now it becomes overbearing. But before, it wasn't the case. So, a lot of the mental illness is a function of age. It's a function of mental degradation, and it's everyone. It depends on how fast it degrades, but since the mind is connected to the body, it's a lot of times that's why the physiological strain is a big component or proponent of mental illness, because it creates havoc within the body and it disrupts stability for the mind and the body to maintain equilibrium. And equilibrium is a key best. It's always generally we have it at birth. We have good, but the genetics dictate the strength of the bond. And we can always strengthen it over time if we take care, of course, of the mind and the body, rather than cause toxicity, because the dose is a poison. Anytime you consume, or whether it's stress, whether it's alcohol, whether it's anything that creates stress internally, pushes you in a direction towards mental illness. Even though you may never reach that point, the genetics are always evolving and always changing. So yeah, that's kind of. I just want to talk about this case. There's a lot of or clarify, the distinction between what we could consider as like a enlightenment, or I wouldn't really consider enlightenment. It's more like when your mind is more open to the stream of information, and that opens the field of creativity. Um, and so long you can organize it, it shouldn't be denoted as mental illness or psychosis. So long it's credible, or as long as it could there are some outlier cases too, and sometimes people's minds work in overdrive and they're just adapted to that state. It's about adaptation. If we move in that direction and we adapt to it, it becomes a norm. It becomes a new higher level. If we push the level higher, it becomes normality, and then the mental illness, the boundary, the upper boundary, or the lower boundary actually raises. We raise the bar, but it could raise it could raise the bar, because um, then like disorders such as mania wouldn't seem as if it doesn't seem like the processing is so fast, even though, because the distinction between depression and mania is massive. But yet, if depression is your typical equilibrium, and you have short periods of mania, it can be quite a huge difference, and therefore probably contribute to anxiety. But if your norm is like close to that boundary, it doesn't. It seems more tolerable. So that's really kind of where it really depends on where the neutral axis is, where the limit exists. And I think that changes over time, depending on genetics and all and so forth. But yeah, that's all I have right now, and hope you enjoy it, and I'll see you next time.